Won the night without names. There are nights that don't ask for your story. They don't want your past, or your future. This was one of them. No names were exchanged. No promises were made. Just a quiet agreement. To stay. And not ask. He paid for one night. Not for love. Not even for comfort. He paid for distance. For the safety of not being known. Because when someone knows your name, they can follow it. They can remember it. They can leave with it. So he kept his name to himself. And she didn't ask. She noticed it, though. The way he avoided saying even the smallest personal detail. The way his voice stayed polite. Measured. Like a door left half closed on purpose. Men like him don't fear being alone. They fear being seen. The room was quiet. Not awkward. Not tense. Just restrained. Silence sat between them, not as emptiness, but as protection. She didn't fill it. She didn't perform warmth. She didn't reach for him too quickly. She simply existed. Steady, uncurious, unafraid. And that unsettled him more than questions ever could. Because silence, when it isn't demanding, has a way of reflecting things back at you. Things you've been avoiding. He watched her hands. Not trembling. Not rushed. Present. And for the first time in a long while, he felt something unfamiliar. Not desire. Not guilt. Exposure. As if, without saying a word, she could already tell that this night wasn't about pleasure. It was about hiding. And the most dangerous thing about that night wasn't that he paid her to stay. It was that she stayed, without asking him to explain himself. Before we go any further, if stories like this speak to something quiet inside you, if you've ever felt unseen, or emotionally unavailable without knowing why, I invite you to subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. We tell the stories people carry, but rarely say out loud. The next part begins not with what he said, but with what he learned to hide. To what money was meant to replace. Money had always been his cleanest solution. Not because he loved it, but because it never asked questions. Money didn't wonder why he went quiet when someone got too close. It didn't notice the way his eyes pulled away, right before a moment turned intimate. Money didn't need explanations. You paid. You received. And everything stayed contained. That was the deal he understood. Because growing up, what he learned wasn't how to love, it was how to compensate. When something was missing, you replaced it. When someone left, you adjusted. And when emotional closeness became dangerous, you found safer substitutes. Control. Distance. Transactions. Money became the stand-in for presence. For listening without asking. For staying without attachment. For closeness without the risk of being needed. He told himself it was practical. Efficient. But the truth was quieter than that. Money gave him something else, an exit. If he paid, he could leave first. No explanations. No aftermath. And no one could accuse him of disappearing. Because the arrangement had already accounted for absence. He wasn't abandoning anyone. He was fulfilling an agreement. That mattered to him more than he admitted. Because abandonment, real abandonment, never announces itself. It happens slowly. Silently. Someone stops showing up. Stops asking. Stops choosing you. And you're left wondering what you did wrong. Money erased that uncertainty. If someone stayed, it was because he paid. If they left, it was expected. Predictable. Safe. But that safety came at a cost. Because when everything is purchased, nothing is freely given. And nothing freely given can ever leave you. That night, sitting across from her, he felt the familiar comfort of the transaction, and the unfamiliar ache beneath it. She wasn't leaning into him, wasn't performing affection. She was simply there. And for the first time, he noticed the emptiness behind the habit. The truth he never said out loud. Money wasn't meant to buy pleasure. It was meant to replace the part of him that never learned how to stay when someone stayed back. Free the way he avoided being seen. He had learned, very early, that being seen was never neutral. It always came with a cost. If someone saw too much, they expected something back. Honesty, availability, presence. And those were things he didn't know how to give, without losing himself. So he became careful. He smiled just enough, spoke just enough, shared facts instead of feelings, safe details, neutral stories, nothing that could be traced back to a wound. He avoided eye contact, not because he was shy, but because eyes linger, and lingering invites questions. He positioned his body at an angle, never fully facing her, as if leaving room to retreat. That was his instinct. Always leave an exit. Because when someone really sees you, they don't just see who you are. They see what's missing. They notice the pauses in your voice, the tension in your shoulders. When a moment becomes intimate, they see the way your breath changes. When affection lasts a second too long. And once someone sees that, you can't pretend anymore. So he stayed just out of focus. Present, but unreadable. Close, but unreachable. He believed that made him strong. Untouchable. But strength built on avoidance isn't strength. It's survival. And survival has no room for being witnessed. She noticed all of it. Not with curiosity. Not with concern. Just quiet awareness. She didn't push past his boundaries. Didn't try to decode him. She simply allowed the space to remain. And that was unfamiliar. Because most people mistake distance for mystery. They chase it. Try to earn closeness. But she didn't. She let him stay unseen, without punishing him for it. And something in him shifted. Because the most frightening thing wasn't that she might see through him. It was that she already did, and still didn't demand that he become more than he knew how to be. For Clara's silence was different. Her silence wasn't empty. It didn't feel like waiting, or withholding, or judgment. It felt intentional. Like a room where nothing was rushed. Where nothing had to be proven. She didn't fill the quiet with questions. Didn't soften it with unnecessary words. Didn't mistake stillness for discomfort. She let the silence exist, as if it belonged there. And that was new to him. Because most silences come with pressure. They demand explanation. They ask you to perform, to reassure, to entertain, to reveal. But hers didn't. Her silence didn't lean forward. It didn't pull information out of him. It stayed where it was. And somehow, that made space. Space for him to notice how loud his own defenses were. The way he usually rushed to fill gaps. The way he controlled moments before they could control him. With her, none of that worked. Because she wasn't waiting for anything. She wasn't trying to get closer. And she wasn't pulling away. She was simply present. Without agenda. Her stillness said, "You don't have to give me anything." And that unsettled him. Because he had learned to measure his worth by what he provided, what he paid, what he offered in exchange. But here, nothing was being traded. No leverage. No subtle negotiation. just quiet. And in that quiet, he felt something loosen. Not relief, but permission. Permission to not perform, not impress, not explain. Her silence didn't ask him to open up. It allowed him to stop holding everything in place. And that was the difference. Not kindness, not patience, but the absence of demand. Because when no one is asking, you finally hear what you've been avoiding. 5. Defining abandonment, the first absence. Abandonment doesn't always arrive as a goodbye. Sometimes, it arrives as an absence. The first one is never loud. No slammed doors. No final words. Just a space that used to be filled. And suddenly isn't. For him, it happened early. Someone who used to show up stopped. Not all at once. Not dramatically. They just became unavailable. Phone calls unanswered. Promises quietly rescheduled. Affection slowly rationed. And no explanation that felt complete enough to trust. At first, he waited. He told himself it was temporary. That people get busy. That love doesn't always look the same. But waiting has a way of teaching children things adults never intend. It teaches them to watch closely, to listen for shifts in tone, to measure love by its consistency. And when consistency disappears, the child learns something else. That closeness is fragile. That attachment can vanish without warning. The worst part wasn't being left. It was not knowing why. Because without a reason, the mind fills in the gap. Maybe I asked for too much. Maybe I wasn't enough. Maybe if I stay quieter, they'll come back. That was the moment abandonment took shape. Not as loss, but as self-adjustment. He didn't cry. He adapted. He learned to make himself smaller, less noticeable, easier to keep. He learned that love required calibration. Too much emotion, and people pulled away. Too little, and at least you stayed in control. So he chose control. He learned to leave space first, before anyone else could. Because the first absence taught him something devastatingly simple. That being wanted was temporary, but being prepared was permanent. 6. When love became unsafe. Love didn't turn dangerous all at once. It changed quietly, gradually. At first, it was warmth, attention, a sense of being chosen. And then, it began to come with conditions. Affection arrived, and disappeared. Praise was followed by distance. Closeness by silence. And without realizing it, his body learned before his mind did. That love could vanish the moment you leaned into it. So he stopped leaning. He learned to stay half present. Engaged, but not invested. He learned to keep a part of himself out of reach. Because reaching for love had consequences. It made people uncomfortable. It made them pull away. Or worse, it made them stay. But change. Love began to feel unpredictable. Not a refuge, but a risk. So he adapted again. He became agreeable instead of honest. Useful instead of vulnerable. He learned that being needed was safer than being wanted. Because need had rules, expectations, clear roles. Wanting didn't. Wanting was messy, emotional, uncontrollable. And when wanting ended, it hurt in ways you couldn't prepare for. So he chose the version of love that asked less of him. A version where he could anticipate loss before it happened. A version where leaving never came as a shock. And over time, his nervous system stopped recognizing safety in closeness. Calm felt suspicious. Consistency felt temporary. When someone stayed too long, he waited for the shift, for the withdrawal, the silence, the absence. That's when love became unsafe. Not because it hurt, but because it taught him that pain was inevitable, and the only control he had was how early he pulled away. 7. Inner adaptation. The man who learned to stay empty. Over time, the adaptation became invisible, not because it disappeared, but because it blended in. What started as protection slowly turned into identity. He didn't wake up one day and decide to feel nothing. He just stopped checking, stopped asking himself what he wanted, what he missed, what hurt. He learned that emptiness was quieter than longing, safer than hope. When you expect nothing, nothing can disappoint you. So he filled his life with structure, schedules, success, predictable routines. He stayed busy enough to never feel the absence, busy enough to confuse numbness with peace. People described him as calm, grounded, unbothered. They didn't see the effort it took to remain neutral, to keep emotions in check, not because they were overwhelming, but because they threatened to return. He trained himself to feel just enough, enough to function, enough to connect superficially, never enough to be undone. Inside, there was a careful balance. If joy rose too high, he lowered it. If sadness lingered, he redirected. He became fluent in distraction, work, exercise, late nights that ended in silence. Anything that kept him from sitting still with himself, because stillness had a way of asking questions, and questions led back to the places he avoided. The truth was, he wasn't empty. He was contained, like a room with the lights off. Not because it was unused, but because no one was allowed inside. And over time, he forgot what it felt like to be full, not happy, not in love, just present. This was the man he became. Not cold, not broken, just expertly unavailable. 8. Clara noticing what he hid. She noticed the things he never mentioned. Not the obvious ones. Not the stories people rehearse to sound complete. She noticed the pauses. The way his voice softened right before he changed the subject. The way his shoulders tightened when closeness lasted a second too long. She noticed how quickly he redirected attention away from himself. How generosity arrived exactly where vulnerability might have. He offered solutions instead of feelings, help instead of honesty. And most people accepted that. They mistook it for strength, for maturity, for self-control. But Clara didn't name it. She didn't label it as avoidance, or fear, or damage. She simply noticed the way he laughed, a little too late. The way he listened, without letting himself be heard. The way his presence felt careful, as if every movement was calculated to not take up space. She noticed that when silence settled, he didn't relax. He monitored it, as if quiet was something that could turn on him. And still, she didn't interrupt. She didn't reach in to pull the truth out. She stayed where she was. Because Clara understood something most people don't. That what's hidden is often protecting something fragile, not something wrong. So instead of asking questions, she slowed down. She matched his pace, his distance, his rhythm. And that's when he felt it. Not exposure, but recognition. As if someone had seen the outline of what he carried, without demanding that he unpack it. Her noticing didn't corner him. It didn't rush him toward confession. It made room. Room for the parts of him that had never been witnessed. Without consequence. And quietly. Without a single word spoken. He realized something unsettling. That the things he hid had always been visible. They were just waiting for someone patient enough to see them, without trying to change them. 9. The cost of staying unavailable. There was a cost to staying unavailable. It just wasn't immediate. It didn't arrive as pain, or heartbreak, or loss. It arrived as distance, spread thin across time. He still had people around him, conversations, connections, but none of them reached all the way in. He was present, without being felt, listened, without being known. And slowly, something began to disappear. Moments passed without landing. Laughter came and went, without staying. Even joy felt muted, as if experienced through glass. He told himself this was maturity, balance, emotional control. But control has a way of shrinking the world. Because when you never reach out, nothing reaches back. People stopped leaning toward him. They matched his distance, not out of anger, but instinct. They learned his limits, and stayed within them. And that's how he became safe, but untouched. Reliable, but replaceable. No one demanded more of him, because he never offered more. No one stayed too long, because there was nothing to stay inside. The cost showed up in the quiet moments. At night. In still rooms. In the spaces where distraction faded. That's when the emptiness spoke. Not loudly. Not urgently. Just enough to be noticed. A subtle ache that asked, "Is this all?" And the answer was never clear. Because staying unavailable doesn't break you. It preserves you. But preservation isn't living. It keeps things intact and untouched by warmth. He realized then that the price of protection was intimacy. That by keeping himself safe, he had made himself unreachable. And the most painful part, no one had done this to him. He had learned it, practiced it, perfected it, until it became invisible. Until the distance felt normal. And that was the cost. 10. When she saw the truth. She didn't discover the truth. She recognized it. Not through a confession. Not through a story he finally told. But through the pattern he never noticed. The way he softened his voice when the moment grew real, then pulled it back. The way his hands hesitated right before touch became meaning. The way he offered care without allowing connection. She saw it clearly. That his distance wasn't indifference. It was fear, carefully disguised as control. Fear of being needed. Fear of being chosen, and then unchosen. She saw that he didn't avoid intimacy because he lacked feeling. He avoided it because he felt too much. Every pause was restraint. Every redirection was protection. And suddenly, the pieces aligned. The calm, the politeness, the emotional precision. Not strength. Preparation. He was always ready for the moment someone would leave. That was the truth she saw. And she didn't say it out loud. Because truth, when spoken too early, can feel like exposure. Instead, she let it exist between them, unchallenged, unfixed. She stayed present, without asking him to be braver, without asking him to change. And that was when something inside him shifted. Because being seen didn't come with consequences. There was no demand, no expectation, just understanding. Quiet, steady, unthreatening. For the first time, the truth didn't feel like an accusation. It felt like relief, as if someone had finally named what he'd been carrying, without asking him to put it down. 11. Naming the truth. You're afraid to be needed. She didn't say it right away. She waited for the moment when silence felt steady, not tense, when the truth could land without shattering anything. And when she spoke, her voice didn't rise. It didn't accuse. It didn't explain. She simply said it. You're afraid to be needed. Not wanted. Needed. The word settled between them. Because wanting can fade. Wanting can change. But being needed asks you to stay. It asks for presence when it's inconvenient, for consistency when things get heavy. And that was the part he avoided, not because he didn't care, but because caring had once cost him everything. He didn't respond at first. His instinct was to deflect, to soften it with humor, to turn it into something abstract. But the truth had already found its place. He realized then that every time someone leaned on him, he subtly leaned away. That every time someone relied on him, he felt the urge to disappear. Not out of selfishness, out of fear. Fear that being needed would make him responsible for someone else's pain. Fear that if he failed them, they would leave. So he kept his distance. He offered help without commitment, care without attachment. And she saw all of it. She didn't frame it as a flaw, didn't ask him to fix it. She named it so he could finally see it. Because naming the truth isn't about blame. It's about clarity. And clarity, for the first time, felt safer than avoidance. 12. The moment he couldn't lie. He had lied in the most polite ways. I'm fine. It's nothing. Don't worry about me. Lies that sounded like maturity, like control, like someone who had it handled. And for years, they worked. Because most people don't press. They accept the smooth answer and move on. But Clara didn't press either. She simply stayed in the space after the words. And that's where the truth lived. After, I'm fine. After, it's nothing. In the pause, he looked at her, and something in him resisted. Not her, but the habit. The habit of staying clean, uncomplicated, unreachable. He opened his mouth to say the usual line, to soften, to dismiss, to hide. And then, nothing came. Because suddenly, lying felt exhausting. Not morally, not dramatically, just heavy. Like carrying a suitcase you forgot you were holding. He exhaled. Slow, controlled, as if he was negotiating with himself. And when he spoke, his voice changed. Not louder, just less polished. I don't know how to do this. The words were simple, almost quiet, but they landed like a crack in something sealed shut. He didn't mean the night. He meant closeness. He meant being seen, without turning it into a transaction. He meant being needed, and not running. His throat tightened. Not with tears, with restraint. Because emotion wasn't unfamiliar to him. Allowance was. He had felt everything. He had just never permitted it to show. So he kept going. Not because he wanted to confess, but because he couldn't return to the lie anymore. I can say the right things, he said. Then paused. I can pay. I can fix problems. Another pause. Longer this time. But when someone actually needs me, He swallowed. Hard. I feel trapped. And there it was. Not cruelty. Not arrogance. Fear. Fear that need would become a doorway he couldn't close. Fear that if he stayed, he would fail. And if he failed, he would be left. Clara didn't react. No shock. No pity. Just a soft stillness. That didn't punish honesty. And in that stillness, he realized this was the moment he couldn't lie. Not because she forced the truth out of him, but because for the first time, the truth felt safer than pretending. 13 Grief without drama. His grief didn't announce itself. It didn't rise up or spill over. There were no tears waiting to fall. Just a heaviness that had learned how to stay quiet. This was not the kind of grief people recognize. It didn't come from a single loss. There was no funeral. No moment the world stopped. It came from years of small disappearances. From love that faded without explanation. From people who stayed close but never stayed long. And because there was no clear ending, there was no permission to mourn. So he didn't. He carried it instead. Like background noise you forget is there until the room goes silent. That's why his grief looked calm. It had been practiced. He had learned how to keep functioning, how to show up, how to succeed, without ever touching the ache beneath it. No one asked him what he was grieving, because on the surface, nothing had been taken. But grief doesn't only belong to what we lose. It belongs to what never arrived. The love that was inconsistent. The safety that was conditional. The closeness that always felt temporary. That was what he carried. Not loudly. Not visibly. But faithfully. And when Clara sat with him, not fixing, not soothing, just present, something softened. Not enough to break him open. Just enough to let the weight be felt. For the first time, he didn't try to outrun it. Didn't distract himself. Didn't intellectualize it. He allowed the grief to exist. Without performance. No drama. No collapse. Just acknowledgement. And that was new. Because grief, when it isn't rushed, doesn't ask for spectacle. It asks for space. 14 Quiet healing. Being seen without being taken. Nothing dramatic changed. There was no breakthrough moment. No sudden relief. Just a subtle shift. Almost easy to miss. She stayed. Not in the way people stay. To claim something. Not with expectations. Not with urgency. She stayed. Without taking. She didn't ask him to give more. Didn't lean into his pain to make it meaningful. She didn't turn his honesty into a bond that demanded proof. She let it be what it was. And for him, that was unfamiliar territory. Because being seen had always come with a price. Attention led to obligation. Care led to responsibility. But this was different. She saw him without rewriting him, without assigning him a role to fulfill. Her presence didn't tighten around him. It left room for him to breathe, without performing gratitude, room to exist, without becoming essential. And slowly, his body noticed. The tension in his shoulders softened. His breath settled, without effort. Not because he felt safe enough to open, but because he didn't feel trapped. This was healing. Without repair. No fixing. No improvement plan. Just allowance. Allowance for who he was. Right now. And in that allowance, something returned. Not trust. Not hope. Capacity. The capacity to remain present, without scanning for the exit. The capacity to feel warmth, without bracing for loss. Being seen, without being taken, taught him something simple. That closeness didn't have to cost him himself. 15. Release without promises. They didn't make promises. Not to call. Not to stay. Not to become anything more. And that mattered. Because promises, to him, had always felt like traps. Words that sounded comforting. Until they became expectations. Expectations that eventually turned into exits. So this time, there were none. No future drawn out in sentences. No reassurance disguised as hope. Just honesty, left where it was. She didn't ask what would happen next. Didn't try to secure a place in his life. She didn't turn the quiet healing into a commitment. And for the first time, release didn't feel like loss. It felt like space opening. Space to leave, without disappearing. Space to part, without erasing what had been real. He noticed how his body responded. No tightening. No urgency to pull away. Just a gentle readiness to let the moment end. As it was. Complete. He realized then that attachment wasn't the enemy. Pressure was. The demand to define things. To guarantee outcomes. To make meaning permanent. Without that demand, he could let go. Without running, he could walk away. Without shutting down. Release, without promises, meant something different. It meant honoring what happened, without needing it to continue. It meant trusting that connection didn't have to be secured, to be valid. And as they separated, quietly, respectfully, he felt something rare. Not relief from closeness, but relief from fear. The fear that staying would always cost him himself. 16. The truth he took with him. He didn't leave with answers. There was no new certainty. No clear plan. No promise of change. What he took with him was quieter than that. He took awareness. The truth wasn't that he was incapable of love, or broken, or emotionally cold. The truth was simpler and harder to carry. He had learned to disappear before anyone could rely on him. He had confused safety with distance, and protection with emptiness. For the first time, he saw that clearly. Not as shame, not as failure, but as a pattern. One that once kept him alive, and now kept him alone. He didn't fix it that night. He didn't vow to be different. But something shifted. He stopped calling his avoidance independence. He stopped calling his silence strength. He began to see the cost of staying unreachable. And that awareness, that honest, unguarded seeing, was the truth he carried forward. Because healing doesn't always begin with action. Sometimes it begins with permission. Permission to notice, to name, to stop running, and maybe, one day, to stay. If this story reflected something you've lived, or something you're still carrying quietly, take a moment. Share it with someone who might need these words. Leave a comment below. Let me know what part stayed with you. And if you're drawn to stories about grief, emotional distance, and the quiet work of becoming human again, like this video, and subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. We tell the stories people rarely say out loud, but often recognize as their own.